September 15, 1944. High above the Philippine Sea, a lone Japanese Zero fighter screamed towards an American aircraft carrier, its pilot committed to a final, desperate act of sacrifice. Below, on the steel deck of the USS Belleau Wood, a young Navy gunner braced himself, his finger hovering over the trigger of his Oerlikon cannon, the fate of hundreds of lives hanging precariously in the balance. In that frozen, terrifying moment, a decision was made that would defy the brutal logic of war, a choice that would echo across decades, binding two men from opposing sides in an improbable quest for understanding, reconciliation, and ultimately peace. This was not merely a fleeting encounter in the chaos of battle, it was the genesis of a profound human connection, forged in the crucible of conflict and tempered by the passage of time. To truly grasp the extraordinary nature of this encounter, we must first immerse ourselves in the grim realities of the Pacific War in late 1944. The vast, azure expanse of the Pacific Ocean had become a theater of unprecedented brutality, a relentless struggle for dominance. By this point, the strategic tide had decisively turned against Imperial Japan. American forces, executing a relentless island-hopping campaign, were systematically dismantling Japan's outer defenses, inching ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, a mere 3 months prior, had been a catastrophic blow to Japanese naval aviation, earning it the grim moniker, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan's once formidable air fleets were decimated, their experienced pilots and aircraft largely irreplaceable. Yet the Japanese spirit of resistance, fueled by a deep-seated cultural ethos of honor and sacrifice, remained fiercely unyielding. This desperation gave rise to increasingly radical and terrifying tactics. The concept of Tokotai, or special attack units, more commonly known as kamikaze, began to emerge as a terrifying new strategy. These were not simply suicidal missions. They were seen as acts of ultimate selfless devotion, where pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into enemy ships, aiming to inflict maximum damage and protect the sacred homeland. Born from a complex blend of fervent nationalism, the ancient warrior code of Bushido, and the stark, agonizing realization that conventional victory was no longer attainable, these attacks transformed aerial combat into a grim, psychological warfare. The psychological impact on both sides was immense, instilling fear and awe in the Allied forces, while demanding unimaginable sacrifice from the Japanese. In this crucible of relentless conflict, the USS Belleau Wood, a formidable American aircraft carrier, steamed resolutely through the vast, indifferent expanse of the Philippine Sea. Her decks, a hive of constant activity, bristled with aircraft, ready to launch or recover at a moment's notice. Her crew, a finely tuned machine of war, operated with precision and unwavering vigilance, constantly on alert for the next threat from above or below the waves. The carrier was an integral part of Task Force 38, a powerful armada of ships tasked with softening Japanese defenses across the region and supporting the impending, massive invasion of the Philippines. Life aboard was a relentless, exhausting cycle of launches, recoveries, maintenance, and the ever-present, gnawing tension of combat. Every sailor, from the highest-ranking bridge officers to the lowest-ranking deckhand, understood their critical role in the grand, terrifying symphony of naval warfare. The anti-aircraft gunners, strategically positioned at various points around the ship's perimeter, were the ship's last, desperate line of defense. Their lives, and the lives of thousands of their shipmates, were measured in split-second reactions, and the absolute accuracy of their aim. Their training was intense, brutal, and ceaseless, their vigilance absolute. For a single lapse, a moment of hesitation could spell catastrophe for the entire vessel and its thousands of souls. The air on deck was thick with the pungent smell of aviation fuel. the bracing tang of salt spray, and the metallic, almost palpable scent of anticipation and fear. Among these dedicated defenders was a young man named Thomas "Tom" Miller, a 20-year-old gunner hailing from a quiet, unassuming town in Ohio. He was, in many respects, just one of countless young men thrust into the maelstrom of war, yet his story would become uniquely profound. On the opposing side, soaring through the vast, indifferent blue of the Pacific sky, was Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, a 24-year-old Japanese naval aviator. Both men, products of vastly different nations, cultures, and upbringings, found themselves on an inevitable collision course, their individual lives inextricably intertwined by the unforgiving, brutal logic of war. Their paths, though seemingly disparate and destined for mutual destruction, were about to converge in a singular, pivotal moment that would defy the very nature of their conflict, leaving an indelible, transformative mark on both their souls, a mark that would guide their lives for decades to come. Kenji Tanaka's journey into the elite ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service began not with a romanticized vision of glory or conquest, but with a profound, almost sacred sense of duty to his family, his ancestors, and his beloved nation. Born in a small, picturesque fishing village nestled along the rugged coast of Honshu, Kenji grew up immersed in the ancient traditions of hard work, communal responsibility, and a deep respect for nature's power. His father, a stoic, weathered fisherman, taught him the unforgiving nature of the sea, the meticulous precision required in every task, and the quiet dignity of perseverance. This formative upbringing instilled in Kenji a meticulous attention to detail, an unwavering resolve, and a quiet, almost spiritual determination. When the call to service came, a summons to defend the Emperor and the Empire, he answered without a moment's hesitation, seeing it as the highest honor, the ultimate expression of his loyalty. His training as a naval aviator was exceptionally rigorous, pushing him to the absolute limits of both physical endurance and mental fortitude. He learned to fly the nimble, iconic Zero fighter, mastering its intricate controls and the complex, often suicidal tactics of aerial combat. The core philosophy of their training emphasized aggressive offense, surgical precision, and the ultimate glorious sacrifice if necessary. He was taught unequivocally that surrender was not merely an option, but an unthinkable disgrace, and that the spirit of Bushido demanded absolute, unyielding devotion to the mission, even unto death. Every complex maneuver, every simulated firing pass, was practiced relentlessly until it became second nature, an instinctive, deadly ballet performed at hundreds of miles per hour. Kenji was, by nature, a quiet, introspective man, but in the confined space of the cockpit, he transformed into a focused, almost robotic instrument of war, driven by the collective will and destiny of his nation. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, nestled in the heartland of America, Thomas Miller's life had followed a vastly different, yet equally compelling trajectory. Growing up in a close-knit, quintessential Midwestern community in Ohio, Tom's world was initially defined by the simple, comforting rhythms of small-town life, spirited baseball games on dusty fields, solemn Sunday church services, and the unwavering support of family and neighbors. The distant rumble of war, initially an abstract concept reported in newspapers and on the radio, slowly but inexorably encroached upon his reality. When the devastating news of the Pearl Harbor attack shattered the nation's peace, the abstract concept of conflict became a stark, personal, and immediate threat. Tom, like countless other young men of his generation, felt an immediate and powerful urge to serve, to contribute to the defense of his country. He enlisted in the Navy, drawn by the promise of defending his homeland and perhaps seeing the wider world beyond his familiar horizons. His training as an anti-aircraft gunner was intense and demanding, focusing on rapid target acquisition, precise lead calculation, and the devastating destructive power of the ship's armaments. He learned to operate the Oerlikon 20mm cannon, a rapid-fire weapon designed specifically to tear apart attacking aircraft with a hail of explosive shells. The drills were constant, relentless, simulating enemy attacks under various conditions, honing his reflexes until operating the gun became an almost unconscious extension of his own body. He was a practical, good-natured young man, but the grim, unforgiving realities of war had hardened him, replacing youthful innocence with a steely, unyielding determination to protect his ship and his comrades at all costs. He had witnessed the horrifying aftermath of previous engagements, the extensive damage, the mounting casualties, and understood with chilling clarity the immense stakes involved in every incoming raid. Before this fateful day, both Kenji and Tom had already experienced the brutal, dehumanizing calculus of combat. Kenji had flown numerous perilous sorties, engaging American fighters in swirling, deadly dogfights over distant, contested islands. He had witnessed with a heavy heart his comrades fall from the sky, their Zeros exploding in fiery plumes, and had felt the chilling, profound emptiness of their loss. Each mission, each loss, reinforced the inherent fragility of life and the absolute, unyielding necessity of fulfilling his duty, no matter the personal cost. He had learned, out of sheer necessity, to compartmentalize his emotions, to push aside fear, grief, and doubt, focusing solely and completely on the mission at hand, on survival, and on victory. For Tom, the experience was equally harrowing and transformative. He had manned his gun during several intense, terrifying air raids, his ears ringing with the deafening roar of enemy engines and the thunderous, concussive blasts of his own weapon. He'd seen enemy planes plummet into the unforgiving sea, sometimes close enough to discern the desperate final moments of the pilots within. He had also witnessed firsthand the devastating damage inflicted on other ships, the wounded screaming for aid, the silent, tragic presence of the dead. These harrowing experiences forged in him a grim, unshakable resolve, a readiness to do whatever was necessary to survive and protect his ship and his fellow sailors. He knew with chilling certainty that the enemy was determined, fanatical even, and he had to be even more so, more vigilant, more deadly. The war had stripped away any lingering illusions, leaving only the stark, brutal imperative of survival and, ultimately, victory. The morning of September 15, 1944, dawned with a deceptive, almost cruel calm over the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea. The air was thick with tropical humidity, the sky a vast, indifferent blue, offering no hint of the impending storm. On the deck of the USS Belleau Wood, the crew was already on high alert, intelligence reports having indicated a strong possibility of a Japanese air attack in the sector. Tom Miller was at his battle station, his Oerlikon cannon swiveling slowly, methodically, as he scanned the seemingly empty horizon, his eyes straining against the glare. Hours passed, marked only by the rhythmic hum of the ship's powerful engines and the distant mournful cries of seabirds circling overhead. Then, without warning, the piercing, ear-splitting shriek of the general quarters alarm shattered the fragile tranquility. "Condition red! Condition red! All hands man your battle stations!" The urgent, disembodied voice blared over the loudspeakers, instantly transforming the ship into a frenetic, urgent hive of activity. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, a familiar, adrenaline-fueled drumbeat. He quickly checked his weapon, ensured his ammunition was fully loaded, and peered through his sights, his eyes straining against the vast, empty canvas of the sky, searching for the unseen enemy. High above, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka was on his final, desperate approach. His Zero, already damaged from a previous brutal skirmish, was struggling, its engine sputtering intermittently, its controls sluggish. He'd been separated from his squadron during the chaos, his fuel gauges dangerously low, indicating that his chances of returning to base were slim to none. In his mind, however, a single, overriding directive remained, clear and unwavering. Find an enemy ship, inflict maximum damage, and fulfill his sacred duty to the Emperor and the homeland. He spotted the formidable silhouette of the Belleau Wood below, a tantalizing yet terrifying target. He pushed his damaged aircraft to its absolute limits, coaxing every last ounce of power from its ailing engine, diving through the scattered, fluffy clouds, aiming directly for the carrier's vulnerable flight deck. This was it. The culmination of his rigorous training, the ultimate expression of his sacrifice, the entire purpose of his existence as a warrior. He envisioned the impact, the glorious explosion, the honor of his final decisive act. He was utterly prepared to die. As he descended rapidly, the carrier's anti-aircraft guns began to open fire, tracer rounds streaking past his wings like angry, luminous hornets, painting deadly patterns in the sky. The deafening roar of his engine, the violent vibration of his damaged plane, the distant concussive explosions of anti-aircraft shells. It all coalesced into a singular, intense, almost spiritual focus. Tom Miller saw the Zero emerge from the clouds, a dark, menacing speck growing rapidly larger, faster, and more terrifying with each passing second. It was flying low, incredibly fast, and heading directly for them. "Incoming! Bearing 030, low altitude!" He yelled into his microphone, his voice tight with urgency, barely audible above the din of battle. He swung his Oerlikon, the heavy weapon moving smoothly on its mount, locking onto the rapidly approaching target. The Japanese plane was incredibly close now, close enough to clearly see the distinctive rising sun insignia painted on its wings, close enough to discern the faint outline of the pilot in the cockpit. Tom's extensive training kicked in, his hands moving instinctively, adjusting for lead, preparing to unleash a torrent of explosive steel. His finger tightened on the trigger, the cold metal biting into his skin. He could feel the tremor of the massive ship beneath him, the concussive blasts of larger guns firing from other positions around the carrier. This was the moment. He had to fire. He had to protect his ship, his comrades, his very life. But then, in a fraction of a second, an inexplicable, almost mystical phenomenon occurred. As the Zero closed the distance, its trajectory seemed to waver, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. And in that fleeting, almost dreamlike instant, Tom saw something in the cockpit, a flicker of movement, a human face, framed by the pilot's helmet and goggles. For a moment, the enemy plane was not just a faceless machine of destruction. It was a young man caught in the same terrifying, dehumanizing vortex of war. His finger, poised to fire, hesitated. A split second. A breath held in time. And then the Zero, instead of crashing into the deck in a fiery explosion, veered sharply, inexplicably, skimming dangerously close over the ship's superstructure, its engine sputtering before disappearing into the distant, hazy horizon. Tom didn't fire. He couldn't. The moment had passed. The immediate aftermath on the Belleau Wood was a whirlwind of confusion, relief, and a lingering sense of unease. The general quarters alarm was eventually lifted, the ship slowly returning to a state of tense readiness, its crew still shaken. Tom stood by his gun, his heart still hammering violently in his chest, his mind replaying the vivid image of the Japanese pilot's face, the moment of his inexplicable hesitation. He knew with absolute certainty that he should have fired. He had been rigorously trained to fire. His sacred duty, his oath, demanded it. Yet he hadn't. He couldn't adequately explain why, not even to himself. His fellow gunners looked at him, some with questioning, curious glances, others simply relieved that the immediate threat had passed. He mumbled something about a jammed mechanism, a momentary malfunction, anything to avoid admitting the profound, unsettling truth of his hesitation. The incident, a mere blip in the grand scheme of the war, was quickly overshadowed by the larger, more pressing events of the conflict, just another near miss in a war filled with them. For Kenji, the experience was equally bewildering and profoundly impactful. His damaged Zero, miraculously still flying despite its wounds, eventually ran out of fuel, forcing him to ditch in the vast, indifferent ocean. He was rescued by a Japanese submarine days later, weak, exhausted, but miraculously alive. He had failed his mission, failed to strike the enemy, failed to achieve the honorable, glorious death he had been prepared for. Yet he was alive, and he too carried the indelible image of the American gunner, a fleeting glimpse of a face that had not fired, a face that had spared him. The memory of that moment, the inexplicable reprieve, would haunt both men for decades, a silent, persistent question mark etched deeply into their souls, a mystery demanding resolution. The war, a cataclysmic global event, eventually ended, bringing with it a profound sense of exhaustion, relief, and a slow, arduous return to a semblance of normalcy. For Kenji Tanaka, the devastating defeat of Japan was a crushing blow, a shattering of the entire world he had known, a profound national trauma. He returned to a homeland utterly devastated, his family's village scarred by the relentless bombing, his future uncertain, his spirit burdened. The memory of his failed kamikaze mission and the American gunner who hadn't fired became an increasingly heavy, almost spiritual burden. He felt a deep, gnawing sense of shame for not having completed his duty, for having survived when so many others had perished, yet also an unshakable, consuming curiosity about the man who had inexplicably spared him. This curiosity, this profound need to understand the why behind that moment of mercy, slowly but inexorably transformed into a decades-long, relentless quest. He spent countless years meticulously piecing together fragments of information, poring over old naval records, contacting veterans associations, driven by an almost spiritual conviction that his survival was not accidental, that there was a deeper, divine meaning to that moment of hesitation. He wanted, more than anything, to look the man in the eye, to ask him directly why he had not fired. Tom Miller, meanwhile, returned to his quiet life in Ohio, a war hero in the eyes of his community, but carrying a secret, unspoken burden within his soul. The vivid image of the Japanese pilot, the precise moment he hadn't fired, remained as clear and sharp in his mind as if it had happened yesterday. He tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as a momentary lapse, a fluke, but the persistent feeling lingered that he had made a conscious choice, a profoundly human choice, in the face of absolute unyielding duty. He built a life, married his sweetheart, raised a loving family and pursued a successful career, but the unspoken question of that day, that single, pivotal moment, lingered like a ghost. He often wondered about the pilot, if he had survived, if he too remembered the encounter. The incident became a quiet, intensely personal reflection on the very nature of war, of humanity, and of the complex, often contradictory choices made in moments of extreme life-or-death pressure. He never spoke of it openly, fearing judgment, fearing that his actions might be misinterpreted as cowardice or disloyalty. But the memory profoundly shaped his perspective, fostering in him a deep-seated, unwavering belief in the power of empathy, even for an enemy. Decades continued to pass. The world transformed dramatically, but Kenji's relentless search never wavered, never diminished. He painstakingly learned English, a monumental task for a man of his age, and traveled to the United States multiple times, attending countless veteran reunions, placing discreet advertisements in military publications, hoping for a lead. His persistence was truly extraordinary, almost obsessive, fueled by an inner conviction that this connection, this resolution, was meant to be. Finally, through a serendipitous, almost miraculous chance encounter at a naval history conference in San Diego, Kenji met a former Belleau Wood crewman. This old sailor, now frail but with a sharp memory, distinctly remembered the strange incident, the Japanese plane that had flown over without firing, and the young gunner who had hesitated. The crewman, recalling the unusual nature of the event, remembered Tom Miller's quiet, almost withdrawn demeanor after the incident. With this crucial, long-awaited lead, Kenji was finally able to track down Tom, now a retired grandfather, living a peaceful, unassuming life in Florida. The first phone call was tentative, filled with trepidation, anxiety, and the immense weight of history. But as they spoke, haltingly at first, then with increasing ease, a shared understanding, a profound sense of recognition began to emerge, bridging the vast cultural and historical chasm between them. They agreed to meet. The reunion, a moment charged with decades of unspoken emotion, was held in a quiet, unassuming park, far removed from the brutal battlefields of their youth. Two old men, one Japanese, one American, who had once been sworn enemies, now stood face to face, their eyes meeting across the chasm of time and conflict. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic cinematic revelations, just a quiet, profound acknowledgement of a shared, pivotal moment that had defied the brutal, dehumanizing logic of war. Kenji, speaking through a translator, explained his decades-long arduous search, his deep, spiritual need to understand why he had been spared, why his life had been allowed to continue. Tom, his voice thick with emotion, confessing his hesitation, his inability to pull the trigger when he saw the pilot's face, a moment of profound, unexpected human connection. He spoke of a moment of shared humanity, a flicker of recognition that transcended the uniforms, the national anthems, and the all-consuming conflict. As they talked, sharing their stories, their fears, their burdens, the immense weight of years, of war, of unspoken questions began to slowly, gently lift from their shoulders. They both realized with a profound sense of clarity that in that single, terrifying instant, both men had made a choice that went against the very grain of their rigorous training, against the expectations of their nations, and against the brutal imperative of war. It was a choice rooted not in cowardice or betrayal, but in a deeper, more fundamental, almost primal human instinct for connection and empathy. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long, peaceful shadows across the park, Kenji and Tom, two former adversaries, found themselves kneeling together. Kenji, a devout Buddhist, and Tom, a lifelong Christian, bowed their heads in a silent, shared prayer. It was a prayer not for victory or vengeance, not for glory or conquest, but for peace, for understanding, for forgiveness, and for the profound, improbable connection that had brought them together across oceans and decades. Their extraordinary story became a powerful testament to the enduring, resilient power of human connection, a quiet, yet resonant counter-narrative to the deafening roar of war and hatred. It served as a poignant reminder to the world that even in the darkest, most brutal moments of conflict, acts of compassion, however small or fleeting, can plant indelible seeds of reconciliation that blossom unexpectedly decades later. Their meeting, born from a moment of hesitation and a lifetime of searching, offered a powerful, transformative message that the human spirit, when tempered by suffering and ignited by the desire for peace and understanding, is stronger than any hatred, stronger than any ideology, stronger than any war machine. The true legacy of Kenji Tanaka and Tom Miller is not found in the numbers of planes shot down or ships sunk, but in the quiet, profound truth that sometimes the greatest act of courage, the most powerful expression of humanity, is not to fire at all. Their story continues to inspire, a beacon of hope in a world too often consumed by conflict, reminding us that even across the deepest divides, empathy can prevail.